Welcome to CUNY Laureates, the show about CUNY graduates who went on to win major awards in their respective fields.
On this episode, we profile another 3 Pulitzer Prize winners who graduated from the City University of New York. First, from Juilliard to Brooklyn College, Sylvan Fox took a chance on a career change and became a celebrated figure in the fast-paced world of breaking news. Then, Ada Louise Huxtable, a Hunter College alum who became the first full-time architecture critic at the New York Times, used her writing talent to fight for the soul of our city. And finally, Queens College graduate Lloyd Schwartz has explored American language in a long and fruitful career as a poet, critic, and educator.
Nowadays, when a news story breaks, most of us can read about it in the blink of an eye. But before smartphones, keeping the public updated wasn't so easy. It required speed, wit, and a whole lot of writing. This is the story of a CUNY graduate who became a Pulitzer Prize winner and the twists and turns he encountered both in the news and in life.
The wreckage of a huge luxury jetliner marks the scene of the worst single-plane disaster in U.S. history.
On March 1st, 1962, as New York City was preparing for a ticker tape parade to celebrate astronaut John Glenn, American Airlines Flight 1 from New York to Los Angeles lost control in midair and took a nosedive, crashing into Jamaica Bay with 95 souls on board. There were no survivors. Working at the New York World Telegram and the Sun that morning is newspaperman Sylvan Fox. As a rewrite man, Sylvan's job is to field phone calls coming from the reporters on site, each one feeding him bits and pieces of information, and to put the pieces together into a coherent story. Within 30 minutes, Sylvan has assembled a full article on the crash, which is rushed out for publication. But his job isn't over. For hours, new fragments of information pour in by phone, and Sylvan needs to update his story for each subsequent edition the paper prints that day. He continues writing and rewriting, working tirelessly to keep an anxious public informed of the day's tragedy. Feverishly typing and fielding calls wasn't exactly Sylvan's initial idea for a career. In fact, this rewrite man had already rewritten his own life story several times before that fateful day. Born in 1928 to a middle-class Jewish household in Brooklyn, Sylvan was named not by his parents, but by his aunt, who thought the name would look good in print. But his first passion was music. Having fallen in love with the classical music he was exposed to in New York's thriving cultural scene, Sylvan decided to attend Juilliard, where he began studying piano. At Juilliard, Sylvan met the woman who would become his wife and mutual life coach through many ups and downs, Gloria Endelman. The two bonded over their mutual love of music, and Sylvan enjoyed exposing this small-town Canadian girl to all the music that New York had to offer. The two married in 1948. With their fates now intertwined, Sylvan and Gloria began to contemplate their future, and found themselves dissatisfied with the general non-musical education being offered at Juilliard. "Hell," Sylvan once remarked to Gloria, "we have more meaningful conversations in the subway than we do in those classrooms." Unsure of what to do and searching for inspiration, the two took time off from school for a sojourn in Paris. This extended immersion into a foreign culture convinced Sylvan more than ever of the need for a high-quality liberal arts education, and upon their return, he decided to finish his education at Brooklyn College. In her own memoir, Gloria Fox describes Sylvan's time at Brooklyn College. He eagerly began his studies like a man fighting the cold water of a spring after a long trek in the desert. Heavy reading assignments, which may have been burdensome for a less agile mind, were a challenge that he welcomed and thrived on. The intellectual stimulation that he had missed so much at Juilliard was now available to him. Combining his credits from Juilliard with summer and winter sessions at Brooklyn College, Sylvan was able to graduate in 1 year, earning a degree in philosophy in 1951. Sylvan had made one rewrite to his education, but wasn't ready to leave music behind. He continued on to UC Berkeley, where he earned a master's degree in musicology, but now faced a difficult choice. Though he wished to compose music, pursuing a PhD would likely mean a life of teaching while attempting to compose on the side. And his experiences in Paris and at Brooklyn College had left him yearning for a life outside of academia. After many long conversations with Gloria, the two decided on the biggest rewrite of their lives, ending their formal education in music. What would come next, though, wasn't clear. Returning to New York, and now with a young daughter, Erica, Sylvan worked a number of odd jobs, while Gloria helped support the family by teaching piano. But it was an ad for a reporting job at the Little Falls Evening Times in upstate New York that caught Sylvan's attention. His renewed desire to explore the wider world made reporting an exciting proposition for him, and after applying, he was accepted to the position. Sylvan immediately demonstrated his skill for reporting. Within only a year, he worked his way up a series of jobs at larger and larger newspapers across the state, where his employers began to entrust him with high-profile stories. But his real goal was to work for a newspaper in New York City, and after several years at the Buffalo Evening News, landed a job at the New York World Telegram and the Sun. At the World Telegram, Sylvan became renowned for his speed in writing, making him the perfect fit for the role of rewrite man. In the hyper-competitive newspaper world of New York City, quickly publishing and updating stories was crucial, and it was this high-pressure task that Sylvan was given on that day in 1962 when American Airlines Flight 1 crashed just outside the city.
Authorities began the grisly task of recovering bodies from the wreckage. The scene was one of dismal futility as firemen and policemen, some weeping openly, waded into the shallow, marshy water to find the remains of men and women who had only minutes before departed happily for a trip to the West Coast.
With more and more information coming into the office well after the morning publication, Sylvan rewrote his initial article not once or twice, but 6 times for the 6 editions that followed over the course of the day. It was a marathon of reporting that would have tested even the most seasoned of newspapermen. Meeting Gloria for dinner later that night and washed out by the long, frantic workday, Sylvan slumped down at the restaurant bar and turned to his wife. "If I'm ever going to win a Pulitzer," he said to her, "I won it today." Though his declaration was said in jest, Sylvan did indeed win a Pulitzer, and it was indeed for that day. In 1963, Sylvan Fox was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in Local Reporting Edition Time, along with his co-workers Anthony Shannon and William Longgood for their work covering the Jamaica Bay crash. Sylvan Fox continued to cover major breaking stories at the World Telegram, including the Cuban Missile Crisis and the assassination of John F. Kennedy, but the rewrites of his own career didn't stop either. In 1964, he wrote a book on the JFK assassination, one of the earliest to take a critical look at the Warren Commission report. And in 1967, he finally landed a job he'd been dreaming of since his days in Little Neck, reporter for the New York Times. On the day of his orientation, news broke of a bank robbery that had just occurred in Brooklyn. Sylvan's new boss told him to forget orientation and get to work on the story instead. And with that, after only 1 day at the New York Times, Sylvan Fox had his writing on the front page.
From his pivot to liberal arts at Brooklyn College, to his big leap into the unknown after Berkeley, to his eclectic work outside the newspaper business, Sylvan Fox rewrote his own aspirations as adroitly as he rewrote the news, culminating in a life of curiosity and learning. And that's a story worth reading about.
Will you welcome, please, direct from the Times, Ada Louise Huxtable. What would you say, though? Isn't New York worse now than it was when I came here a few years ago?
I think New York is getting progressively worse. In fact, the things you said at the beginning of the show, which were so amusing, also made it very clear how bad it is. The breeze that stops the subway and the pollution in the air. And yet we are all very dedicated. We do stay here. And you say you'd like to leave, but there is a tremendous commitment to the city by many people. There's something about the city. It has a kind of a magic and magnificence in spite of all its problems that keeps people here.
Ada Louise Huxtable, the first full-time architecture critic at the New York Times, may have looked like a gentle soul, but you wouldn't want to find yourself on the receiving end of her criticism. She loved the city and its history and despised any new work of architecture that didn't fit in its grandeur. According to Ada, good architecture was every New Yorker's right, and she was more than willing to dedicate her career to defending it. This sentiment, however, didn't develop in a vacuum. Born in 1921 to a middle-class family on the Upper West Side, Ada was exposed to good architecture since her early childhood. In fact, her family home, St. Urban on 285 Central Park West, was a well-known New York City landmark. Her appreciation for good architecture only grew stronger after she started attending art history classes in another famous New York City landmark, Hunter College. It was there that she had her first experiences with hands-on design. Her set design work on the Hunter College productions of Yellow Jacket in 1940 attracted some curious eyes at the New York Times editorial and heralded her later involvement with this giant of American journalism. While at Hunter, she also won the first prize in an interior design contest sponsored by Bloomingdale's. This eventually led to her employment in another iconic building. After graduating from Hunter with honors in 1941, she started working at the Bloomingdale's flagship store on Lexington Avenue. Her tenure as a sales clerk in the furniture department was cut short after a surprising encounter. Many young architects and designers made the obligatory tour of the rooms, she later wrote. One of them noticed and married me. Garth Huxtable, an industrial designer, became Ada's partner, not only in marriage, but also as a lifelong supporter of her illustrious career. Ada continued her studies at NYU's Institute of Fine Arts, and in 1946, she was offered a position at the Museum of Modern Art in the Department for Architecture and Design. Working under the famed architect Philip Johnson, she developed a keen eye for modern architecture, an ability that would prove extremely valuable in her later career. In 1950, after receiving a Fulbright Fellowship, she left the Museum of Modern Art and spent a year in Italy, studying post-war Italian architecture. And in 1958, she received a Guggenheim grant for research in the field of structural and design advances in American architecture. Equipped with this new knowledge and experience, Ada returned to her home city and started writing. At first, her elegant writing style seemed a natural fit for the pages of more traditional art magazines, where the ideal of aesthetics in architecture left little room for questions about practicality or social impact. As her articles started addressing contemporary topics, It became evident that her writing talent came with an extraordinary ability to break down even the most complex issues of modern architecture and make them relatable to everyday readers. This ability didn't go unnoticed, and in 1963 she was hired by the New York Times as the first full-time architecture critic, a position specifically created for her.
There was no architecture critic. In fact, when I started writing for the New York Times and when Clifton Daniel asked me to do the job full-time, he said, "What shall we call you?" And we decided that it was architecture critic.
Using the New York Times as a platform, Ada continued her professional ascent. As her intelligent and fearless commentary started shaping the views of the general public, the underlying theme of her criticism became more evident. Architecture is not an isolated act of creating physical structures. It is a social practice that has profound effects on urban environments, as well as on the lives of the people who live in them.
I think it's the greatest of the arts because it is such a complex art. It's the art we must live with. You want to experience painting or sculpture, it's an option. But there is absolutely nothing optional about your experience of architecture.
As one of the defining voices of the modernist era, Ada was known as a supporter of change and innovation in architecture. But, unlike some of her modernist contemporaries, she also understood the importance of historic preservation. Deeply affected by the demolition of the historic Penn Station site, she wrote, "We would probably be judged not by the monuments that we build, but by the ones that we destroyed." Over the years, she became known as the champion of the preservation movement and used her influence to promote the enactment of the first landmark law in 1965. Yet her understanding of preservation went far beyond the regular traditionalist point of view. She heavily criticized what she called the Disneyfication of New York, seen in the corporate beautification of its historical sites. This fierce criticism of the corporate-driven architecture and the lack of meaningful planning in the public sphere became the defining characteristic of her life work. Feared by many and respected by all, this petite woman became both the darling of the public and at the same time its most fearsome critic. In 1970, Ada was awarded the first ever Pulitzer Prize for criticism, and in 1981, at the age of 60, after working in the daily grind at New York Times for nearly 3 decades, she received a MacArthur Fellowship. Now financially independent, she was able to quit the New York Times and start writing on her own terms. This, however, didn't mean less productivity. For another 3 decades, Ada Louise Huxtable continued to write with the same youthful passion and commitment, covering the widest range of topics, from biographical accounts to questions of public zoning, discussions about the essence of architecture or protection of cultural sites. In her last article, published a couple of weeks before her death at the age of 91, Ada made a case against the proposed radical remodeling of the New York Public Library. In her passionate plea, she argued that the Beaux Art masterpiece plays an essential role in keeping the city's dynamic vitality and brutal beauty alive. Less than a week after her text got published, New York Public Library announced that it was going to reconsider its plans for remodeling. In 2013, a year after Ada's death, the Getty Institute announced its acquisition of her archive, a huge body of work containing 93 boxes and 19 file drawers of Ada's manuscripts and other documents. But even larger is the impact she had on the city she called home, where she implored a generation of architects, city officials, and real estate developers to reconsider the relationship between the future and the past. And to half a century's worth of ordinary New Yorkers, this soft-spoken architecture critic had the roar of a lion.
American language is relatively young. known for unadorned and plain-spoken expressions. But can poetry be found there? This is a story of a CUNY graduate who became a Pulitzer Prize winner, a writer, critic, and educator whose use of American vernacular in his art and criticism is both poetic and true.
Yes, no, maybe, sometimes, always, never. Never? Yes. Always? No. Sometimes? Maybe, maybe never sometimes. Yes, no, always. Always, maybe. No, never, yes.
Lloyd Schwartz is a poet, and this is his poem, a sestina called 6 Words. Lloyd has been writing not only poetry, but criticism for at least 50 years, in conjunction with teaching. But how did he end up late in his career being named the Poet Laureate of Somerville, Massachusetts?
Always, never.
His story starts on a small Brooklyn block.
I was born in Brooklyn Hospital. The part of the street that I lived on was demolished by Robert Moses for a housing project.
After moving to Middle Village following their forced removal, Schwartz went to high school in Queens, where his interest in poetry was sparked by a teacher.
He would do anything to get his students interested in poetry. And I remember at one point he leapt onto his desk and recited the dagger speech from Macbeth. Is this a dagger that I see before me? He made us see that poems were actually about something. They weren't just words on a page. And I was totally enamored, enthralled. And I thought, this is what I want to spend my life doing.
Schwartz enrolled at Queens College to follow his bug for acting, but was still not entirely sure which direction his career would go.
I thought I was going to join the drama club. And I went to the first meeting of the dramatic club, and the kids in that club struck me as being too full of themselves. And I thought that isn't what I was interested in when it came to theater. I went to the literary magazine.
Over the next few years, Schwartz became the poetry editor at Spectrum and another Queens College magazine called New Poems.
I would go to meetings and just my jaw would drop because these incredibly talented students were writing wonderful work. Queens was just a great experience. It was essentially free. My college education cost me $80 plus books.
Right afterwards, Lloyd received a scholarship to enroll at Harvard University to pursue a PhD. In 1976, he earned it.
I really wanted to go to Harvard because Robert Lowell was there. And I wanted to meet him and work with him. He was writing some of his greatest work, and I got to know him. He was not writing anything that I could imitate, except that he encouraged people to write what they had to write, and in their own way of writing.
While at Harvard, he made money teaching and acting, but also doing voice work for the radio, in particular, an NPR program for kids called Spider's Web. Schwartz settled in Somerville outside of Boston, where he's lived since 1984, and eventually became an English professor at University of Massachusetts. And in 2019, at the age of 78, he was named the Poet Laureate of Somerville.
In my experience, good teachers were absolutely crucial to who I am and what I do. I really believe in teaching, and I really love traditional poetry. Poetry on the page, poetry that has been written and published and republished and republished over the centuries. It's maybe the most important thing in my life and certainly in my intellectual life. I'm working on a poem that's so true, I can't show it to anyone. American language as it's spoken can be very, if not exactly beautiful, can be extremely rich and poetic. I thought that's what I had. That's what I could do. Poems in the voices of other people, or poems that were really very plain spoken, or that played with language in a way that I could be very fancy if I had to be, if the subject called for that, but that I could also, in the same poem, undercut that with a kind of plain spoken language that had its own eloquence. I think if my poems have any value, that's the value that they have. I was very interested in the beat poets, and Ginsberg especially.
I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness.
And I was very interested in what is now called the New York School. So Frank O'Hara remains one of my favorite poets.
We are drifting back and forth between each other like a tree breathing through its spectacles.
He was a kind of role model because he also had these poems that were just, he seemed to be throwing them away, but at the end of the poem you were in tears. You were so moved by them.
Over his 60-year career, Schwartz has published 5 books of poetry. But very much related, he has been a music critic, writing for the Boston Phoenix, the city's weekly alternative paper.
It was a very serious paper, and in the Phoenix I could write at great length about what interested me. I write reviews with this hand and then I write poems with this hand. There's a connection between them, and it has to do with really being a good listener and being able to convey what it is that I've heard. If I say this was a great concert, I want people who are reading me to have some of the experience that I've had and why it was something that moved me or made me laugh or both.
Schwartz won the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism in 1994.
Whatever talent I have for doing that has to do with having a good ear, having an interest in performance and in live performance. It's all related to the other stuff that I do.
But after his long teaching career at University of Massachusetts, Schwartz recently retired after more than 50 years. He now organizes Let's Talk About a Poem, an online poetry discussion group.
Writing is a very lonely thing. If you're a critic and you're at a concert with hundreds of other people, you're surrounded by hundreds of other people. But when you write about it, you're all alone and you're next to your computer now or your typewriter. I think part of what I wanted to do as an actor was, quote unquote, communicate my feelings on a stage to a large number of people. And I guess I want to do that as a poet also. There was one summer returning over and over. There was one dawn I grew old watching.